In the US, we live in the most propagandized place in the world, much more so than, for example, in Israel itself, much more so than in many places in Europe. But in the States, it's a very propagandized country around this, where there's a well-funded, systematic effort to make sure that Americans remain ignorant of the facts on the ground. Then we have to be able to answer the propaganda. We have to be able to unpack the propaganda, to be able to peek behind the curtain that creates it and take it apart. And as you do take apart the propaganda, to offer a counter-narrative in its place. I'm a great believer that the more you know about a familiar world, how a familiar world is constructed, the better position you're in to change it. And that's what that's what I hope to give you today, is resources about how this stuff gets talked about. Not what the facts are, but the way in which the story has been told. A little background, about 10 years ago, we did a film, the Media Education Foundation did a film called Peace Propaganda and the Promised Land, US Media and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Some of you may have seen it. It's actually available for free on the web. If you put in Peace Propaganda, Promised Land, you'll get a free version of it. About 5 years ago, actually perhaps a little bit more, we started a new film, especially as a response to, we started in response to the first Gaza war, and we didn't know that there were going to be continual Gaza wars, and so the film actually kept getting delayed because they kept attacking Gaza, and so we had to deal with more and more things as they were going on. But we have a new film, and the new film is called The Occupation of the American Mind. And I want to focus on a particular case study, which I think is important right now in terms of how the propaganda works, which is the attacks by Israel on Gaza in 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. And there will be another one next year, because Gaza performs essentially a propaganda function for Israel. And the attacks on Gaza perform a propaganda function. And so there is no doubt that there will be another war, because the three wars that have been taking place so far, they're not wars, the three attacks that have taken place so far have been prompted by Israel. They have been created by Israel, they have been waged by Israel, and not because of anything real that's happening on the ground, I think largely because of its propaganda value. When Israel launched its attack on Gaza in 2014, it was in fact, as I said, the third attack against Gaza in 6 years, and the bloodiest. It was an absolutely vicious attack. Over the course of 45 days, the Israeli military dropped nearly 20,000 tons of explosives on the crowded streets of Gaza, on the prison that is Gaza, where people have no place to hide from the bombs. In the process, it killed nearly 2,200 Palestinians, wounded tens of thousands more, and I know you know these facts. I know you've seen the images as well. Most of the dead and injured were civilians, including a large percentage of women and children. Over the same period, 5 Israeli citizens and 66 Israeli soldiers were killed. That is not a war in which there are two sides going against each other. This was a massacre of a population that was absolutely defenseless. And in a just world, the Israeli leaders who launched these attacks should be in shackles in The Hague, being tried as war criminals in a world where justice actually mattered. As news of the disproportionate number of Palestinian civilian casualties made its way around the world, the result was international outrage around the world, with mass protests throughout the Arab world, in Europe and beyond. The United Nations passed and multiple resolutions condemning Israel's actions as a clear violation of international law. That's around the world. in the US situation was different. Even as horrific images of destruction and Palestinian suffering filled American news programs and social media, support for Israel among the American population held firm. American politicians of both sides, who are so divided on so many issues, Democrats and Republicans, divided on so many issues on this, were unanimous and vocally supported Israel throughout the bombardment and the subsequent invasion. The American news media, it's not an accident why that should be the case, American news media reverberated with the claim that Israel did everything it could to avoid casualties and was acting, but it was just they had to act because they were under attack, and they were acting in justifiable self-defense. That was a story told again and again and again. And polls showed that the American people, while clearly troubled by the sheer brutality of the invasion, had far more sympathy for Israelis than for the people of Gaza. As I said, the contrast with the rest of the world is striking between America and the rest of the world, but it's actually nothing new. For decades now, the American people, since at least, I'll show you, I can actually give a date for it, it's around 1982 it starts. For decades now, the American people have shown far greater sympathy, sympathy for Israelis than for Palestinians. Apparently, Americans seem to be unfazed by the fact that for almost 5 decades, Israel has been occupying Palestinian land, has been building settlements, has been in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in clear violation of international law, and in fact, in clear violation of US policy in the region, or US policy towards Israel and Palestine. In clear violation, but it seems to make no difference. The level of support is pretty stunning, and we have to look at the numbers carefully. Last spring, the Bloomberg News Organization released this poll. The question that was asked was, so I go at the top, when it comes to relations between the US and Israel, which of the following do you agree with? And they were given 2 choices as to which to agree with. On the one hand, you could either agree with Israel is an important ally, the only democracy in the region, and we should support it even if our interests diverge. Even if our interests diverge, we should support Israel. 45% of Americans think you should support, they would support Israel above the interests of their own government. 47 said, well, actually, I think U.S. interests should prevail, and 8% were not really sure. That is, as I said, that's a stunning. Those are stunning numbers. If you want to know the success, if you want to see the success of a propaganda campaign, it is right here. Glenn Greenwald, who reported on this, actually that's where I got this from, on this puts a lot of it down to the evangelical beliefs that about 25% of the American population holds, that believes that the end times require Israel to spread from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. And therefore, whatever Israel does has to be supported because it is the word of God. None of it is based on any strong knowledge of what's, of the region, or the strong knowledge of the facts on the ground. In fact, the level of ignorance is pretty remarkable on this. There is very little correlation between knowledge and opinion on this. I teach large lecture classes at UMass, and I do a survey at the start of the lecture, start of the class, before we do anything, right? Before we, okay, what do people, and I wasn't really interested in what people thought. I was interested in what they knew, because what you think is be based on what you know. So I asked them this question. It's a multiple choice question. The question was, which of the following countries has been continually condemned for illegally occupying other people's land in the Middle East? Okay, it's a factual question. There is only one answer. Israel has been continually condemned in the United Nations for illegally occupying someone else's land. So I gave 4 answers that they could give for it. Israel, the correct answer. I couldn't call it Palestine, so you have to say the Palestinians. And then 2 countries it couldn't possibly be, Kuwait and Lebanon. I did this over the course of 3 years or so, and the predominant answer, the majority answer, was the Palestinians. These are students at UMass is, supposed to, it's in liberal Massachusetts at a public university. These are, between 58 and 68% of them in the polls that I did thought that the Palestinians were illegally occupying someone else's land. The first kind of misunderstanding that people work with is that the situation is really complicated. Right? There's no way we can understand it because these people have been fighting each other for thousands of years, and it's just there's always this cycle of violence. There's always fighting, and who knows what the real situation is. There's an intractable situation, and going on for thousands of years. Actually, and I'm sure most of you know this, right? The history is actually fairly easy to comprehend. When I teach this, I could actually do the history in about an hour. Without bias. I just like the basic facts of the situation. The international consensus is absolutely clear. And so one of the things that propaganda has to do is when things are clear, when things are simple, you have to make it seem complicated. And then you have to give a simple solution to it. The solution is that the problem is the fault of the Palestinians, that the current situation, the fault lies with the Palestinians. And right now, it used to be with the PLO, but right now, the major obstacles to anything is Hamas. And that's the story. Israel would love to have peace, except for these crazy people who want to throw Israel, they want to throw the Jews into the sea. And therefore, how can we possibly negotiate with them? How can we possibly even talk to them? Okay, Israel doesn't have to do very much to convince the U.S. To do what he wants, to support it, because U.S. policy is already there. U.S. policy is already supporting Israel because it's in the interests of the U.S. So Israel doesn't have to manipulate American political elites, American economic elites. They're already on board. And the reason America supports Israel is not because of the Israel lobby. The reason America supports Israel is because of strategic interests in the region, and Israel as a proxy for the U.S. The U.S. is involved in Israel is part of the U.S.'s imperialist project. Doesn't need the Israel lobby for that policy. Israel, the policy of the United States towards Israel will be the same if the lobby existed or not. That's determined by something else. The major function of the Israel lobby is, in fact, to lock down the discourse. Is once the policy has been set to make sure that there can only be one way to talk about it, that there is only one way to understand it, and to punish anyone who breaks with the dominant narrative. Look at the Iran deal that Obama negotiated with, that represents American interests. There was full court press from the Israel lobby to make sure that deal didn't go through. They failed because, in fact, it was in American interest for the deal to go through. So there are limits to the Israel lobby when it comes to policy. They tried to change it, but that's not what's going to impact American policymakers. Before 1967, the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is not particularly special. We now talk about a special relationship. In the first few decades of Israel's existence, they weren't an enemy, but they weren't really a close ally. For example, in 1956, when Israel invades the Sinai during the Suez crisis, the United States forces it to withdraw. Either when Israel, Britain, and France attack Egypt, the U.S. forces Israel and in fact the other nations, to withdraw. That changes because there is no special relationship yet. They are not, as President Nixon would say after 1967, they are not the cop on the beat yet. That changes in 67, the Six-Day War. The Nixon administration, looking for partners in the Middle East, looking for proxies in the Middle East, looks at what Israel did in 67 and says, essentially, we can do business with these guys. And that's when Nixon talks about Israel as the cop on the beat, and that's when the special relationship, the strategic special relationship, starts in 67. And why does Israel have to do this? Well, Israel has to do it because we know explicitly Israel wants to maintain permanent control of all the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. That's the version of Greater Israel that Israeli leaders from the start have signed on to. That was the Zionist project from the very start. Unfortunately, there are a few million, Palestinians, the original inhabitants of the land, in the way, and you have to kind of deal with them in some way. It's absolutely, the occupation there is dependent on the occupation here. The Israel Project was the foundation that hired Frank Luntz, to come up with essentially what's the phrases that work, what's the frame that's going to work, and he was hired to do research on this. It's called the Global Language Dictionary. You can find it online, download it, read it, and you can see how the propaganda works. I said it's not a 1 or 2 page report. It's just like a 70-page report full of the results of Luntz's research. One of the most important findings is this one, which is where do most voters get their Middle East news or their information about the Middle East? And what they found was that the television is where most people get their information about the coverage, and therefore that's where the focus has to be. You have to make sure that the stories of television are contained within the narrative, within the allowed narrative. The aim of the strategy, this is the aim of all PR. The aim of all PR is actually to put your words into the mouths of other people. Okay, so Israeli spokespeople introduce terms, they introduce words, they introduce phrases, they introduce ideas, and then if you're successful, then actually media representatives pick it up, and they start talking about it in exactly the same way. Politicians pick it up and start talking about it in the same way. So in the end, someone else is saying your words, and it doesn't seem like your words, it seems like their words. That is how PR is supposed to work. PR works invisibly. Advertising works directly, right? This is not advertising, this is public relations and propaganda. The basic narrative, and I'll give you some examples of this, the basic narrative is that Israel is presented as both an underdog and as a victim. That first off, that Israelis live in a dangerous neighborhood. That's the phrase, a tough neighborhood. The narrative is that Israel wants peace. It doesn't, it wants land. But there's no one on the Palestinian side to negotiate with, because the Palestinians just keep continually attacking them. They're anti-Semites, they're Muslim fanatics, etc. So what is poor Israel supposed to do but defend itself? What Israel does is always in response to an attack from others. They have to be seen as just retaliating to actions taken by someone else. That's the overall argument. Now, how do you do this? This is quite a feat. How do you do this when, for the almost 50 years, you've been involved in a brutal occupation and colonization that has been condemned by the rest of the world? And the ultimate aim of which is the control of territory. How do you do it? Well, as any good magician will tell you, and this is why Gaza is key, as any good magician will tell you, the major thing you have to do is you have to misdirect people. Right? That's what the magicians do, right? I mean, they say, look over here, and this hand is doing whatever the trick is. Okay? It's to get your attention somewhere else, so you're not focusing on the real thing. And that's the function. That's what actually that's what essentially what Frank Luntz in his document says. Is you have to misdirect people. He says you have to convince people that this is not about territory. Because if it's about territory, then it's about the occupation. Right? This is not about territory. This is about terrorism. When you talk about the 67 borders, when you say 67 borders, support for Israel falls off. Because it reminds people that, in fact, before 67, that land was not controlled by Israel. So it brings up Israel's military history. And so he says, don't talk about 67. Talk about something called defensible borders. And you never define what defensible borders are. Just talk about defensible borders. Do not mention 67. This is a quote this is Frank Luntz. He says, okay, Americans agree that Israel has a right to defensible borders, but it does you no good to define exactly what those borders should be. Avoid talking about these borders in terms of pre or post 1967 because it only serves to remind Americans of Israel's military history. Particularly on the left, this does you harm. For instance, and there's support for Israel's right to defensible borders dropped from a heady 89% to under 60% when you talk about it in terms of 67. He says, in fact, when you talk about land in terms of 67, you can completely flip public sentiment against you. But if you call into question the danger of terrorists shooting down planes, you shore up support. Now, this is the key phrase here. Whatever you do, don't talk about history. Whatever you do, don't talk about facts. Whatever you do, don't talk about, right? That's what he says. That's misdirection. Don't talk. How do you get people to talk about something else? Well, how do you get people to talk about something else? If I only had 3 words, the most important phrase, if you want to understand Israeli propaganda, is the phrase that Luntz uses himself. It's about terror, not territory. If you can get people talking about terror, you're not talking about territory. If you can get people, and that's what the Gaza wars are around. The Gaza wars, what's it all about? Hamas launching rockets, Hamas, attacking Israel, Hamas, and the occupation is forgotten. What occupation, right? Is there an occupation going on? So the whole of the West Bank and what's going on there doesn't even make its way into public perception. Everything becomes the conflict becomes about Gaza, and the conflict becomes around Hamas. Once you do that, you don't have to think about the occupation, you don't think about the settlements, you don't have to think about the house demolitions, you don't have to think about political prisoners, you don't have to think about the checkpoints, you don't have to think about the refugees. What you do is you take your eyes off what is really going on, right? What's going on is what Norman Finkelstein says is an annexation process. The siege is not about security. The siege is about inflicting collective punishment on the Palestinian people, and to make sure that the next time they have a vote, they do not elect someone. They don't elect actually possibly what is an effective opposition like Hamas. To make sure that whatever gets elected is in fact a weak leadership. Israel carries on policies after it withdraws, it carries on its policies of targeted assassinations. It actually attempts to inaugurate a coup against Hamas to try and bring it down. Hamas responds with ineffective rockets. The Hamas is like, the response is like, it's like a small child that can't do anything else. And in the end, it just kind of does whatever, it kicks out widely, even though there's no rationale to it. There's no rationale to it. And Israel knows that's exactly the response that it wants. From 2005 to 2008, as Hamas is, bombarding Israel, 11 Israelis are killed. In a lesser period, between 2005 and 2007, over 1,200 Palestinians are killed. including over 222 children. So in this period, when apparently Hamas is just launching rockets, the major victims are Palestinians. There is a ceasefire in June 2008 between Hamas and Israel, and you can see it in the middle here. This is rocket fire from Gaza, and the rocket fire from Hamas comes to zero. And the only rockets that are launched are these ineffective rockets by other splinter groups that Hamas has no control over. Israel breaks the ceasefire on November 4th, 2008 by killing 6 Hamas operatives. I'm sure some of you know this. Most Americans don't know this. Israel breaking the ceasefire? It was Hamas that broke the ceasefire. It was Hamas that started to launch rockets time and time again. It wasn't Israel that broke the ceasefire, it was Hamas, and therefore whatever Israel did in response is regrettable, but they were simply responding to the breaking of the ceasefire by Hamas. Not true. Israel breaks the ceasefire. They break the ceasefire on November the 5th. What else happens on November the 5th, 2008? Okay, it's the day of Obama's historic election, when the whole world is looking elsewhere. And in fact, the New York Times, being the paper of record, actually reports the breaking of the ceasefire. It's on page 10 of the New York Times. One little piece, but it's buried away on page 10. Israeli strike is first in Gaza since start of ceasefire. Israel breaks the ceasefire. Israel breaks the agreement. Hamas then responds to the breaking of, responds in the ineffective way that it normally does. Israeli spokespeople go on American media, and start lying. The prominence and success of the BDS movement is again when Netanyahu, when he spoke to AIPAC a couple of years ago, spent 40 minutes talking about BDS. And for me, that's, people like Chomsky and Finkelstein, they have these critiques of BDS. And I just want to shake them sometimes and say, look, forget about this as a real policy, this is an ideological tool. And BDS has broken through the barrier. And people are talking about BDS, and it doesn't really matter if you think it's effective or not. Recognize it as the tool that it is. It's a different way of talking about it. In the end, what is required, I'll just end with Chomsky. In the light of all this propaganda, in the light of citizens of so-called democratic societies being the targets of propaganda, what is their duty? He says, this is Chomsky said this a long time ago. He says, citizens of the democratic societies should undertake a course of intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control and to lay the basis for meaningful democracy. And I think around this conflict, around this issue, the battle perhaps in Canada as well, I don't know enough, but certainly the battle in the US, the battle is a battle around ideas. It's a battle around how the story gets told and how the story gets understood. And that's in the belly of the beast, and depending upon how that goes, it will have an impact. If American public opinion shifts, policy will come under pressure at the same time.